Alrighty, so welcome all to our DPS Trial Prep Tuesday. So the first thing I'd like to go over is some basic DPS techniques. So to start out with, I want to go over light weaving. So basically all the techniques are just going to be really simple stuff, nothing to do with rotations, specs, gear, none of that, just what buttons to press, how to press them, and when. Just some easy basic techniques. So starting off, light weaving. So there's a global cooldown in this game. If you're not familiar with global cooldowns, basically it is the internal time between any two skills, abilities that you cast to prevent you from being able to basically spam them as quickly as you can possibly mash buttons. You are limited by a global cooldown. What's neat with this game is that light attacks and skills are on different global cooldowns. So when you use a light attack, you don't have to wait an entire global cooldown to cast an ability. You only have to wait an entire global cooldown to cast another light attack. Same thing goes for abilities. You don't have to wait a global cooldown after an ability to light attack. You only have to wait a full global cooldown to use another ability. So light weaving basically takes advantage of the fact that light attacks and abilities are on two separate global cooldowns that do not trigger each other. The way that this works is you start out with a light attack, and you basically interrupt the animation early with an ability to cut off the tail end of the animation. And I will demonstrate here with Daedric Prey. So this is Daedric Prey. You guys mind putting pets away just to clean demonstrations up a bit? Whose pet's that? Thank you. Alright, so Daedric Prey, there's little runes on my hands. I'm going to show you guys a light weave. So, this here is a basic light attack into an ability. This is not light weaving, this is just light attacking into an ability, and you see there's a global cooldown in between. But if you time it early, give me a sec. I always forget to take him off before I do this. Not about combat. There we go. Much better. Okay, anywho. So this is the normal light attack into an ability. If you don't light weave, you see there's a full global cooldown of approximately 1 second between the two casts. But if you cast the ability early, right at the tail end of the light attack leaving your weapon, you can shave off quite a decent bit of time. So this is a proper light attack. This is a global cooldown. You can see the difference immediately. So you can basically queue up the ability immediately after you've actually hit the light attack, and you want to be doing that before all of your abilities. For one, you barely add any time to your actual rotations. Basically, if you were to just cast ability after ability after ability, it would take about 1 second per ability. By adding the light attack, it only adds about 0.2 seconds per ability cast, but it adds a significant amount of damage. It procs your enchants, it has a chance to proc your poisons, and it has a chance to proc a lot of other various effects. So it's well worth the extra 20% time that it adds to your rotations. So you want to be doing that before all of your abilities. So if you guys want, you can go ahead and practice some light weaving on the dummy. I suggest choosing a very obvious animation to practice with so that you can see. And I'll show you guys one other one. So a very clear one is liquid lightning. So you guys see I raise my hand all the way up over my head and drop it all the way down. And I can weave very quickly into this from a light attack. Now, in addition to light attacks, there's also animation canceling. So it's basically the same premise as a light attack, but instead of canceling out of a light attack, you're canceling out of an ability. So, just to back up real quick, light attacks can be canceled by abilities, blocking, or swapping weapons. Abilities can only be cancelled by swapping weapons or blocking. So, for animation canceling, again, I'm going to use Liquid Lightning for this one. You see the animation, I'm bringing my hand all the way up over my head and slamming my elbow down. If I were to block right as the animation begins, you see how I skipped the entire animation. You can do the exact same thing by swapping weapon bars. And feel free to practice these at any time, you guys, on the dummy while I'm talking.
I have a good example with a nudge. This is a full nudge animation. It's super long. And now I will block cancel it. And you see it's coming up. Compared to this. Saves a lot of time. And then same with weapon swap. I'll weapon swap it. Same amount of time.
Now, the important thing about this is that it allows you to get into your next light attack of like a few fractions of a second quicker. And those few fractions of a second add up to a lot of time in your overall rotation. And it will up your DPS by quite a bit. Now, the more important one is light attacks, so I do suggest working on your light attacks first, and then work on your cancels. You can always work those in. Overall, canceling is only going to up your DPS by about 10%, whereas light attacking can add a full, like, 10k or more. Okay, so do you have any questions so far about light weaving or animation canceling? Okay, so the only other thing I want to add for techniques that's very important for DPS is blocking. So when you block, you will use, so you hold block, get a little shield in front of you. While you are blocking, you will not gain any of the resource that you would use for blocking, which for by and large, it's stamina. The only exception to that is if you are using a Frost Staff with the correct passives, it costs Magicka to block, but for pretty much everyone, it's going to be stamina. While you are blocking, you will not regenerate stamina. Definitely remember that. So you don't want to be holding block if you need your stamina. When you're blocking, if you take a blockable hit, it will reduce your stamina by a set amount, and it will reduce the damage of the attack by 50%. In addition to that, hard crowd control like knockbacks, stuns, many of which are ignored if you block the attack that had the crowd control attached to them. So there are quite a few examples. There are giant meteors in Helroth Citadel that drop on top of you. If you're blocking, you half the damage and you don't get knocked down. That is very important as you get into some of the harder content. There will be a lot of crowd control that you really want to avoid. Not to mention there are a lot of attacks that will be one-shots, if not close to one-shots, unless you're blocking, and then it's halved. So it's important to know that you know how to block and know when to block. But in addition to that, know that you can cast while blocking. You can cast any ability while blocking. The only thing is when you swap weapons, your block will drop for a fraction of a second, so keep that in mind. The only thing you cannot do while blocking is light attacking, because if you light attack, you will bash instead of light attacking. So one little expert technique I'll just go through quite quickly. You're probably not going to use it too much, but it's worth noting. As I said earlier, light attacks can be interrupted by abilities. They can be interrupted by swapping, but they can also be interrupted by blocking. You can light attack, interrupt the light attack with the block, and immediately cast an ability. And you can essentially weave your normal rotation while blocking, only dropping it for a millisecond while you're getting that light attack out. Very complicated, really next level stuff, but it is something to keep in mind for those fights where you're getting pelted by necessary block damage. Still being able to keep up a little bit of your rotation, a little bit of offense, while you still have to block that incoming damage. Okay, anybody have any questions so far on techniques? Alright, so just in conclusion for techniques, I would strongly suggest you guys practice individual abilities because they all have a slightly different rhythm to them. I suggest practicing them one at a time, back to back. Like, just practice your Date or Pray and really get a feel for how the light weaving rhythm works with that particular ability. Then start working in a cancel to get used to that rhythm. And then, just like steps in a dance, you start putting all those different abilities together into your full rotation once you're comfortable with the rhythm of each. You're going to have a lot more success that way, and you're not going to learn as many bad habits in just trying to push through your rotation without actually taking the time to get a feel for the rhythm of each ability. Okay, so next I want to cover stats. So first of all, very important bit for DPS, regeneration. So you absolutely can have too much regeneration. Basically, what I would suggest doing, once you're comfortable with your rotation, work on this 3 mil dummy right here. That will be equivalent to, for most people, it'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 minute fight with, you know, decent DPS. That will be relatively close to what real boss fights will be like. So if you can sustain your rotation fully through that full 3 million dummy, you are good on regeneration. You have enough resources, your sustain's good. So that's what I would suggest testing. If you have significantly too much, you know, if you're not anywhere close to 0 by the end of killing a 3 mil dummy, you actually probably have a little bit too much. So different ways you can pull away and take in less regeneration is with your food. Your food buff can and often does have a regeneration bonus if you use Camoran Throne for stamina or Witch Mother's Brew for magicka. So you can switch to these technically stronger foods which give just health and magicka or health and stamina as opposed to the additional regen. It'll give about 1 to 1.5k more of each instead of the regen, so you can get a bit more tankiness and a bit more base stat if you want to drop some regen that way. Or another place you can drop regen on potentially is on your jewelry. Most jewelry comes pre-enchanted with the relevant stat regeneration. If you haven't already, you can replace those with stronger enchants for potency if you already have enough regen. Example being spell and weapon damage. Yes, thank you. So if you have too much regen, that's what you want to do, is you want to look at those. But also, to the same ends, if you don't have enough, those are the same places you want to look. You want to check, are your weapons, or I'm sorry, are your jewelry enchanted with regen? Are you using regen food? In addition, you can also gain more regen with enchants. There's a magicka, magicka damage, magic damage, magicka regen weapon enchant, and there's a physical damage, stamina regen weapon enchant as well. You can slot one of those, especially on an infused weapon, for an additional boost of resource management. But it's also worth mentioning that pretty much all classes have their own special sources of resource management that you should definitely exhaust before playing with your stats. Any questions about that so far?
I just want to add. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, like, is there a specific number you should be aiming for in regen, or is it kind of vary from class to class?
It varies super dramatically. For example, this pet sorcerer that I am on right now, I'll show everybody, has, let's see, 786 magicka recovery, which, as I'm sure you guys know, is literally nothing. That's like poop magicka recovery. But yet, I can do my full rotation on this guy, even without magicka steel provided by an external source. I can go through this entire 3 mil dummy without coming close to running out of magicka. If there's a magicka steel up, which, side note, magicka steel will always be up, your healers will be providing it in groups, keep that in mind. With magicka steel up, I don't even come close to 50%. It's just because of my rotation and my spec. It has to do with how much your abilities cost, it has to do with your class, It has to do with how many heavy attacks you're doing. I mean, there's a lot of factors that affect your resource management. But yeah, I'm actually kind of glad you asked, because that brings me back around, I forgot to mention, Magicka Steel. So any of you Magicka DPS, make sure that when you are testing, as I said to do on this 3 mil dummy, make sure that you or someone else is providing Magicka Steel on the target, because that is going to be consistently available in groups, and a really significant source of Magicka sustain. And you don't want to end up putting a bunch of extra Magicka regeneration up. Come to find out, you get into a group, they provide Magicka Steel, and you realize you have way too much, and you could have had more potency stats.
So on the opposite end of that, Michael's using a rotation where he does a heavy attack every 6 seconds, and he has, what'd you say, like 700 Magicka recovery?
Yeah, like 7 and some change.
I am at 1441 stamina recovery on this character, and then I also have a Netch, and I never heavy attack. So that's what I'm aiming for, 1441 plus a Netch, and I never have to heavy attack. So it's kind of, it depends on your class, and it depends on your rotation.
And he's also a red guard, which has a racial passive that gives some stamina. I mean, like, there's resource recovery, resource management tricks everywhere, in every nook and cranny. So the point is just to make sure you look into all those and find a good balance, and make sure that you have the bare minimum resource management. You don't want to have too much, you don't want to have too little. You want to test on the dummy, make sure you have the bare minimum, and dump everything else into potency. Alright, any other questions about regen?
Oh, I did want to add that, just with it, you did mention it, but I just want to emphasize, in this latest patch, Murkmire, they did change the absorb stamina enchant. Before it was magic damage and absorb stamina, which is stupid. Now it's physical damage and absorb stamina.
Much more usable.
So yeah, it's actually worth considering. So if you haven't read about people using that before, that's because it was doing magic damage. It does physical now. It's worth considering.
Alrighty. So any questions? Alright, moving forward. Stats. So next thing I want to talk about with stats is penetration. So all enemies have a set amount of resistances, same as we do. There's spell resistance and there's physical resistance. Obviously, spell matches your spell damage, physical matches your weapon. So if you're stamina, you've got all of your weapon stats, you've got stamina stats, you're attacking against someone's physical resistances. Magicka and spell damage, spell resistances. Pretty simple. But, that said, your average enemy has little bit more than 1,800 of each, and there are a multitude of ways that you can both reduce those resistances with debuffs, as well as penetrate those with your own stats. Long story short, because I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty details of all the different ways, as a trial DPS, you can expect that a significant amount of those debuffs will be provided by your group, examples being Alkosh, Crushing Weapon, Major Fracture and Breach, etc. Once all of that is said and done, you need a total of 5,850 penetration. So one more time, 5,850 penetration. Now, for stamina DPS, you've got to come up with 5,850 penetration. One of the common options is using the Lover Mundus, which gives straight up penetration. And then I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 if you have all Divine's gear. And then making up the other bit of penetration with a few champion points. There are lots of different options though, just wanted to throw out some of the obvious ones. There are also a couple of different sets that give a bit of penetration. That's just something to look into, but just know that what you're going for is 5,850 total. One thing to keep in mind though is that that stat is not displayed anywhere. You do actually have to add it up based on all of your different sources. It's not just on your character sheet. Now, Magicka. If you are wearing at least 5 pieces of light armor, which if you're Magicka DPS, you better be, you gain an automatic, I think it's like 4,000 something. Let me just confirm here. Ta-da! You gain 4,884 spell penetration just for wearing armor, because Magicka's easy. So you already have 4,884 spell penetration, which means you literally only have to make up 966 remaining. So, that 966 remaining, you can, honestly, the easiest way is just to pop a couple points in your champion points, which I am showing to all these lovely people who are watching the video eventually. So you want to get just a smidge over 900, which requires 10 points in spell erosion, which is in the apprentice tree of the mage.
I will just say to, if you're not keeping all the numbers straight, they're in the sticky links in Discord. If you scroll up quite a bit, there is a PvE penetration guide that I wrote out, which I write out all the numbers that you're aiming for and how to get all the different sources for stamina. And obviously magic is easy. However, it is a little outdated because in this patch they took away the 100 base, so basically add 100.
I got a question. For the DPS dummies, do they have physical and spell penetration on them?
Exactly the same numbers. Basically,
Okay.
all PvE enemies are going to be that 1,800. It's 18,200 or something like that.
So, like, tweaking my
they're not
champion
different.
point penetration should show like a difference in the when I do like a parse.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the thing is, so this whole thing I'm going through stats is literally in priority order. So I mean, first things first, you gotta make sure you have the resource management to get through your rotation without having to stop against the long-term boss fight. The second thing is literally penetration. Penetration gives you the most bang for your buck, point for point. But the thing is, if you have too much, it's doing literally nothing. You cannot over-penetrate an enemy. You cannot take away resistances that they do not have. So that's why it's important to get to that 5,850 mark, but do not go over. If you go over, it's a complete and utter waste. So, the next priority for stats is your potency stats. So, potency stats, kind of like regen, it's all over the map because it's different per class, it's different per build, there's a lot of different sources, there's a lot of ways to go. But something to keep in mind, the three major potency stats are max resource, so that's either magicka or stamina, damage, so either weapon or spell damage, and crit, so weapon or spell crit. Technically speaking, there's also crit damage that kind of gets factored in there, but there are very limited sources of crit damage, and they're pretty static, so it's not something I'm going to talk about here, as it's not really something you can switch up gear and get more of or less of. So, damage, max stat, and crit. The important thing is that you are balancing those resources. If you have an incredible skew in one, and there's a significant lack of another, you are going to overall lose damage. So for example, if you have 50k magicka, you have a lot of magicka, you literally aren't going to be able to get as much spell damage and spell crit, and your overall DPS will suffer because all of those stats interact in a kind of multiplicative way because they all pile on top of each other, whereas additional magicka will be straight up additive. So, something that is kind of nice though, this game does not have diminishing returns. So, whether you're adding 1,000 magicka to go from 30 to 31, or whether you're adding 1,000 magicka to go to 50 to 51, that 1,000 magicka will increase your ability by the same flat amount. The only problem is, as I said earlier, if you already have 50,000 magicka and your flat damage is as it is, you have very low crit, which is multiplicative, because you're getting a % chance to do a % bonus damage. And you'd rather have the perfect balance of a large base stat plus a large chance to do a large amount of extra damage. That make sense? The only problem with that is it's different depending on the class and the spec. Really weird example is, again, a pet sork. pet orcs get their pets do not scale with spell damage at all. So spell damage is one thing that they actually do tend to skew rather low and go really hard in magicka and spell crit. But they're literally the only one. Every other spec, every other class is pretty much going even across the board. Just to give you guys rough ideas, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30k max resource is pretty healthy for both magicka and stamina. For crit, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% crit is pretty healthy. Damage is basically whatever you have left after you've reached those marks. If you have well in excess of 3 to 3.5k spell or weapon damage, you likely don't have enough crit chance and max resource. Everybody follow all that? Have any questions? Alrighty. So moving on, something I already touched on a little bit was food. As I said, food is something you should absolutely have on all of the time. You should base all of your stats around having food. You should have your food on when you're parsing, and you should make sure that you have the appropriate food for the stats that you need. Technically speaking, as we already talked about, Camoran Throne and Witchmother's Brew, they get the most bang for their buck because they're spread between 3 different stats. But again, if you don't need the extra health, if you don't need the extra regen, it might be worth using one of the foods that's split between 2 different stats. Thank you. Split between 2 different stats, like one I'm about to link. So this is just max health and max magicka, and you see that it gets a significantly larger amount of both magicka and health, but loses out on the magicka recovery. So again, that's what I use on this build because I get significantly more damage out of magicka, and I don't need the extra recovery at all. So to each their own, but in most cases, the Witchmothers and the Camoran Throne are the kind of best in slot for most basic DPS builds. Alright, any questions on stats? Are we good to move on? Alrighty. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is basically wording. So what I want to cover here is making sure that people are reading and really understanding their abilities, their gear, etc. Because some of the wording can be a little bit tricky. So, for starters, buffs and debuffs. So you'll notice that a lot of different skills and abilities that you have will apply different types of buffs and debuffs that are normally preceded by the words minor or major. So, in those cases, minor, major, self-explanatory, one is smaller, one is larger. There are a minor and major buff for pretty much all of the available buffs. Not all of them, but almost all of them have a minor and a major version. That said, any one target, if it's a buff, obviously friendly, if it's a debuff, enemy, but any one target can have 1 copy of minor and 1 copy of major of the same buff at the same time. No more. They do not stack. So for example, Fracture. Fracture is a debuff on the target that reduces their physical resistance. There's a minor, there's a major version. One target can have minor fracture, one target can have major fracture, but they will only ever have 1 copy of each, period. And they can have 1 copy of all of the different minor and major buffs, but there will only be 1 copy of the exact same worded buff at a time. So keep in mind for yourselves that the same thing does apply. You want to make sure that you're aware of what buffs and debuffs are generally being supplied in group play, and make sure that you're not going out of your way to apply those same buffs and debuffs, because they're not going to stack, and it's not going to be a good use of your time. Example, as I've already covered, healers provide Magicka Steel. Magicka Steel will not stack, there can only be 1 source, so there's no point in any DPS applying Magic Steel if the healer already has it covered. Another example, as I said, is Fracture and Breach. Major Fracture and Major Breach are automatically applied by the Sword and Shield taunt ability. So your tanks are going to be providing that constantly. Every single time they taunt a boss, they're going to be breaching and fracturing that boss. So any abilities you have that you're considering choosing over others, based on having Major Fracture or Major Breach, is not relevant in group play because it's already going to be active on the boss. You might want to consider, like for example, spammables. You might want to consider a spammable that does a little bit more damage but doesn't supply that same debuff because you can't have two copies. Alright, any questions there? Alrighty, so important buffs and debuffs to have. As a DPS, there are buffs that increase our recoveries, which are important. There are buffs that increase our crit, which is also important. And there are buffs that increase our damage. There are buffs that increase our crit damage. So, for stamina and for magicka, we have endurance and intelligence, respectively, for recoveries. Those are very important to have up, as I said earlier, for your general regen. You want to make sure that you have those buffs active when you are gauging how much resource sustain you have. But one thing to keep in mind is they're very, very easy to get. Any potion, including a trash potion, that restores your max resource will also give you major endurance if it's stamina, major intelligence if it's magicka. So just by using the potion, you have a 20% bonus to your recovery. For depending on if you have all the alchemy skills and stuff, it will be the entire time that the cooldown is down. So as soon as the cooldown goes back up, the buff should be dropping and you can reapply it immediately. So in addition to that, as I said, there's also damages. So there is brutality for weapon damage, and there is, make sure I get this right. Yes, okay, so it's brutality for weapon damage and sorcery for spell damage. Those will give you a 20% boost to your weapon and spell damage respectively. Those are also available via potions and should strongly be considered. And last, also for potions, is crit chance. Savagery is the weapon crit, and prophecy is the spell crit. You can get a potion that has all three, that has endurance, savagery, and brutality for stamina, and has intelligence, prophecy, and sorcery for magicka. All three at the same time, and gives you a little chunk of max resource when you use the potion. Those are strongly advised. They can only be crafted. Thank you. They can only be crafted, and they are strongly advised for once you have practiced your rotations and you've gotten serious. They provide all the buffs, and in very difficult content like veteran trials and such, you should be using those on boss fights when they are off cooldown. Those will provide you a significant buff to your damage as well as your resource sustain. So the only other one that's really, really important, because I mean there's all kinds of buffs you can play around with and read up on, but the other one that is very important for DPS is crit damage. The passive is called, the buff is called Force. There are a couple ways you can get it, but for the most part, the two major ways are from the trap in the Fighters Guild line. That is most often used by stamina DPS because it does physical damage, but it can also be used by magic DPS, especially those magic DPS that are in melee, like a Dragon Knight, for example. Because the trap has a melee morph that basically makes it last twice as long. That is the most efficient morph and limits it to melee use. So more often than not, that's only really used by melee DPS specs. One of the other sources, though, is the, I think it's called Channeled Focus, is that correct? Channeled Focus from the Sigic line. I don't have it on this character, actually.
Channeled Acceleration.
Channel Acceleration, thank you. Channel Acceleration from the Sigic line. It takes a second to cast, but it lasts for frickin' ever. It lasts for like 30-something seconds. And that will give you Minor Force for the entire duration, and it is literally just that. It is just a buff that gives you Minor Force. I think it gives you a little bit of movement speed for like a couple seconds, but really it's just a buff to give you Minor Force. Minor Force is a 10% increase to your crit damage, which is very significant. Very, very significant. So that's an important buff to make sure that you have, if it is relatively available to you. Definitely try to work that into your spec. Okay? Any questions about buffs and debuffs?
Going back to the potions, did you mention medicinal use?
A little bit. I didn't specifically name it, but thank you. Yes, so medicinal use is the passive I was referring to in the alchemy line. So to make sure that your that the buffs from your potions do in fact last long enough that you have another potion cooldown up before they run out, you should have alchemy leveled and points in medicinal use, which will increase the duration of the buffs applied by those potions, which will make sure that they last long enough. Alright, any questions so far? Okay. Alright, so another thing I want to talk about now is the wording of abilities. So when it comes to your skills and abilities, you will see that a lot of them will say direct damage. So direct damage, first of all, in pretty much every case, when you attack a target, you will see that there are some numbers that float up top and are either white or yellow. And there are some numbers that go kind of down below their bar, which are often orange. In pretty much every single case, the orange numbers are damage over time, whereas the white numbers are almost always direct damage. Now, there are a couple weird exceptions just because they like to keep us on our toes for some reason when they could just make it simple, but for pretty much all cases, the lower orange numbers are damage over time, and the top numbers are direct damage. That's very relevant because there are a lot of procs and a lot of passives and such that are specifically mention direct damage or damage over time. And it's important to know what type of damage, you know, your attacks are actually doing. For the most part, it's pretty self-explanatory though. Direct damage is damage that hits once, immediately, and that's it. Damage over time is things like corruptions, poisons, afflictions, burns, etc. Things that continue to do gradual damage over a period of time. Pretty self-explanatory. But also there are different element types. So there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, technically 7 elements in the game. 4 of them are magicka, and 3 of them are stamina-based. So the 4 magicka are magic, very self-explanatory, magic, but then the specific elements are fire, frost, and lightning. On the stamina side of things, there's physical, also poison, and disease. So those specific ones, pretty much any ability that that names those types will often scale with the relevant stats. But it's also important to know that, as I said earlier when I was talking about procs and abilities, some of them will say procs on fire damage, procs on physical damage, etc., etc. Make sure that you are reading your abilities, you are reading your skills, and you see what type of damage they deal, and that you know, understand how the different abilities and the different elements synergize with each other. Alrighty, so I wanted to talk about the wording on a lot of different armor set procs, a lot of different equipment set procs. So one thing that's very, very important that I want to point out that a lot of people do not know or understand, a lot of abilities, or I'm sorry, a lot of sets use the word ability. So it'll say procs on a 10% chance to proc on fire damage, on a fire damage ability, proc on a physical damage ability, etc., etc. Ability, a lot of people think refers to the castable actions down on your bars. That is not accurate. The actions on your bars are referred to as skills. skills are technically abilities, but there are a lot of other things other than skills that are also abilities. Also included in abilities are weapon enchants, special statuses like burn and poison, additional set procs like those from your monster sets, or any types of special damage from your like 5-piece sets. All of those things, even passive effects from your class skills. So if you have like a class passive where there's a chance to proc a damage or a heal, those are all considered abilities. So any type of set that reads like procs on fire damage ability, that'll include burn, that'll include a fire enchant, that'll include some special fire that you procced with a class skill. Anything fire counts as an ability. It's not limited to just your actions, just your skills. Alright, and then one other thing I wanted to cover with set procs is that many of them have a set chance. Make sure that you are reading your set procs and you know the chance that the chance for your abilities to proc, as well as what they need, what the conditions are for them to proc. It's very important with really factoring and doing the math and figuring out how potent a potential set proc is. You need to be able to factor in what the actual probability of that proc going off. In addition to the duration versus the cooldown of the actual effect. So, a great example is Burning Spellweave. If anyone happens to be wearing that, that would be awesome. I'm not, but Burning Spellweave is a great example. Do you mind linking that? So,
yeah, sure.
I believe Burning Spellweave is a 15% chance on fire damage to do... Yeah, let's see. Let me pull this up. Alright. So we have, you have a 15% chance to apply the Burning Status effect. I'm sorry, when you deal damage with a Flame Damage ability. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier. Flame Damage ability, that's not just your skills. That's all of the things that count as abilities, as long as they do flame damage specifically. It'll proc the burn, and it will give you spell damage for 8 seconds. This effect can only occur every 12 seconds. So 12 seconds is obviously the cooldown. That means that this proc goes on cooldown once it's actually procced for 12 seconds. You cannot even try to proc it again for 12 seconds. But the actual effect, the 507 spell damage, lasts for 8 seconds. So already, right off the bat, you can see it's going to be up for 8 seconds. It has a cooldown of 12. 8 over 12, it's going to be a, let's see, math, 2/3 uptime. So right off the bat, at the absolute best chance, if it were a 100% chance to proc, it's only going to be up 2/3 of the time to begin with. On top of that, it only has a 15% chance to proc. So that means after 12 seconds, all of your fire damage that happens consecutively will have a 12% chance. So it's not going to proc right off the bat. I mean, it only has a 12% chance of proccing off that first hit of fire damage after 12 seconds. So in reality, it depends how much fire damage you're doing. So that's something to consider. If you're trying to make the most of a set like Burning Spellweave, you need to make sure that you can deal a lot of individual fire hits per second. So it's important to utilize, for example, a lot of fire dots, like burning, fire enchants, fire damage over time abilities, like Firewall of Elements or Dragonite dots. You need to have a lot of fire over time so that you have 4, 5, 6 hits of fire damage per second to make sure that you're not spending 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds after that cooldown's up without getting another proc. You need to capitalize on that chance. Does that make sense? Basically, the point is, make sure you're really accurately reading your abilities and doing the math, so that you understand how to utilize those things, and make sure you're really making the most of them. Alright, so, moving forward, going to talk about gear a bit. For starters, ability procs, like I was just talking about, cannot crit, and they do not scale with any of your potency stats. So, a perfect example of that would be monster sets. There we go. So here I've linked the Maw of the Infernal. As you can see there, the 2 set has a chance to summon a Daedroth. That Daedroth does a basic attack that hits for 5,363 flame damage. That 5,363 whatever flame damage will not scale with my spell damage. It will not scale with my magicka. It will not scale with anything, and it cannot crit. It will always do flat damage. The only thing that can increase an equipment set proc damage, or potency, because it can be a heal as well, is percent increase. So for example, any percent fire damage I have would increase it. So for example, I'm a high elf. I think I have, it's either 3 or 4% increase for just being a high elf. Let me see, 4. So as a high elf, I have elemental talent, increases flame, frost, and shock damage by 4% flat. So that Daedroth will have 4% more damage because I'm a high elf. Also, same thing goes for champion points. There are a lot of champion points that increase direct damage by a % chance. They increase damage over time by a %. All of those percentages do affect your procs, but none of your scaling stats, as I said. Alright, so, also having to do with gear, I want to talk about special weapon sets. So, for starters, let me link this. Alright, this here is the Maelstrom Lightning Staff. So there are currently in the game 4 different types of weapon sets. As you'll see there, that weapon has just a simple 2 set that changes, that has a bunch of special effects I'll get into in a second. But the point is that these weapons are individual sets that only require equipping the relevant weapon, and they are standalone sets, not like the typical monster sets or 5-piece sets that you find for other equipment. Most of these are incredibly potent, and they change the effects of one of the skills for that particular weapons type. The modifications are often so dramatic that most specs almost require at least one of the better sets as part of the spec. Not going to get into all the different options and stuff. You guys are free to look at that, but I just want to go through real quick. There's Maelstrom. Maelstrom, there's one for each different type of weapon, first of all. There are Maelstrom weapons, which come from the Maelstrom Arena, which is a solo arena. You can only get them on veteran mode. There are the Master Weapons, which come from Dragonstar Arena, which is a 4-man, and like the Maelstrom, you can only get them on veteran. Recently added, literally today, with Murkmire, are the Black Rose. You can get them, that is a 4-man, you can get them on normal or veteran, but in normal, they will have one less stat. Basically, the veteran has a perfected version, and the perfected version has the addition of a single stat bonus, so it will be slightly stronger than the one you get from normal version. And finally, there's the 12-man Asylum weapons, which come from Asylum Sanctorum. You can get those on normal and veteran, but like Black Rose, the normal ones are weaker than the veteran, but as opposed to being a stat, the actual effect is slightly weaker on the normals than on the veteran. For example, the Resto Staff would reduce the cost of healing by 27% from the normal, and it's 30 from the perfected from the veteran. So there's 4 different ones for each weapon. They come from those 4 sources. Very easy to look up. I suggest looking at them. They can dramatically change specs, so get creative with those. But the important thing is, you want to pair them with a weapon set that allows you to have all of those effects active at the same time. So, for example, you'll see I have this set here, just linked, called Undaunted Infiltrator. Undaunted Infiltrator has a really neat 5 set. So the 5 set is when you cast an ability that uses magicka, your light attacks deal extra damage, and your heavy attacks deal extra damage for 10 seconds. So, it's 100% guaranteed to proc whenever you use magicka, which is super easy, and the buff applies to your person and lasts for 10 seconds. I'm going to demonstrate for all the viewers. You will see that when I cast it, my arms light up red, and I get a little buff that lasts for 10 seconds. What's really neat about this is this buff stays up even when I switch weapons, which is what I was talking about. So I just switched to my back weapon, I still have my glowy arms, and when I throw down my Wall of Elements with my Maelstrom staff, I get the effect of the Maelstrom set, switch back, and I still had the Undaunted Infiltrator effect the entire time. So the point is, it's important to look for sets that have a, basically a sustained remains in play type proc to pair off as a weapon with one of the set weapons so that you can utilize the entire 5 set while still switching weapons, if that, want to make sure that makes sense. Another example is for stamina, they'll often use Advancing Yokeda. If anyone happens to have that and could link that, that'd be great, but if not, I'll explain. Advancing Yokeda is a stacking buff, works similar to the Undaunted Infiltrator, where it puts a buff on the actual person, thank you. It puts a buff on the actual person that gives them additional crit rating, and the important thing is it lasts for 5 seconds. So as long as you spend less than 5 seconds at a time in your back bar where your set weapon is, you will maintain the full effects, which allow you to have a monster set, 2 5 sets, and a single set weapon, all being utilized simultaneously. But you gotta make sure you pair the right kind of sets up on your weapons to really make use of those set weapons. Whereas, say you had a flat set that just gives you, say, 3000 penetration. As soon as you switch out of that weapon to your set weapon, you no longer have penetration. That's what we're trying to avoid, is losing a flat set. Alright, any questions about that? Alrighty, continuing on with gear. So, real quick, stamina. For using armor, different types of armor pieces. Stamina, obviously want to use medium. Cool, no problem. Stamina, obviously want to use medium. Because of these unique stamina passives from the medium skill line, stamina prefer to use a full 7 pieces of medium gear. That's specifically because in the stamina line, you get a bonus crit per piece of gear. So the medium actually gets a lot more potency stats from going for a full 7. Whereas all the different armor types do have just a minimum 5-piece bonus, where, for example, on the light armor, none of their potency stats are on the single per piece set passives. They're only on the minimum 5. So they can go with a minimum 5 pieces of light, and then use 1 piece of medium and 1 piece of heavy, without losing any potency stats, just losing a little bit of resource management, but gaining 2% per type of magicka, stamina, and health through the Undaunted Metal passive, which is over there in Undaunted, if you're not familiar with it. Once you're at, I believe it's Undaunted 9, you get 2% per piece, and since you go 5-1-1, you get a total of 6% of each for using all those different types of armor. Plus, you get a little bit more resistance out of it, you get a couple of neat passive effects, so that's just something to consider. Alright, so other than that, so I want to cover quickly weapons. So for the most part, stamina prefer to use bow and dual blade. Mainly this has to do with the damage over time that's available. On dual blades, there are a lot of passives that are very strong for potency. And on the bow, there are very, very good dots. So it makes a lot of sense to, from bow, use abilities like Poison Injection and Hail of Arrows. Switch into a dual blade, which has significantly more potency, which affects all of those abilities once you've switched. As well as has its own very powerful dots like Rend. So there's a lot of different ways you can swing it, but basically the point is you want to make sure you have lots of dots, and that is generally why for stamina, dual wield and bow is the advised meta. But there are a lot of ways you can stray. Feel free to talk to me if you want to mix things up, but for magicka, obviously destruction staves straight up, there's really no competition there. But the thing is, there are two different destruction staffs that are generally offensive, Inferno and Lightning. They do change some of the destruction abilities slightly. You can read into that. They'll explain it in the abilities, in the actual skills, if you're curious about that. But the most important thing is they have different styles of heavy attacks. The Lightning does a long-channeled heavy attack, whereas the Fire Staff does a single charged fireball. And then in addition to that, the Fire Staff has an 8% increase, thank you. The Fire Staff does an 8% increase to single target damage, whereas the Lightning Staff does an 8% increase to AoE damage. So depending on your spec, depending on whether you're doing more AoE versus more single target, you might find that one staff is more beneficial than the other for certain situations. Most of that will be outlined in different specs, just kind of wanted to gloss over that real quick. Any questions about that? Alright, moving forward, and on the last bit, just going to wrap this up real quick. Skills. So, first thing is dots versus spammables versus buffs versus passives. Okay, so dots, damage over time. I already talked about that a little bit. Damage over time is anything that, self-explanatory, does damage over time. But there are also spammables. Spammables are most often single target direct damage abilities that are often much cheaper, and because they're cheaper, and because they only do big direct damage, you can use them back to back without cutting off additional damage that you've already paid for. If you used a damage over time, one on top of the other, you would cancel out the old ability and lose out on a whole bunch of damage that you already paid for. So a spammable is an ability that doesn't have any damage over time or basically any timed effects that you're already paying for, such that you can use them back to back without any drawbacks. Then there's buffs. So there are some abilities that are literally put on your bar just to cast on yourself to gain a specific relevant buff. Examples being shields. There are also, let me think, there's like Green Lotus that the Wardens have, which gives them the crit buffs. There's all kinds of examples, but basically anything that you have to cast specifically to give yourself specific buffs, but doesn't have damage in it, or any kind of other effects in and of itself. And last, passives. So there are a lot of abilities that are literally on your bar and do not get activated pretty much ever. Just for having them on, just for having them slotted, they passively give effects. A great example of that is the Inner Fire for the Mage Guild, which gives major sorcery and some max magicka just by having it slotted, which I'm using right now. That's my L1 for those watching the video. And for stamina, they can use literally the exact same ability. Something Camouflage from the Fighters Guild does the exact same thing. Just for having it slotted on your bar, you gain those passive effects. So,
yes. For Wardens, they have Bird of Prey, which now gives 8% or Minor Berserk, just for being slotted. So, it's a new patch.
Just something to keep in mind, make sure you read your abilities and see the different passives and the different abilities that they give just for being slotted. That's very important. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about like the slotted passives. So there's two different kinds of slotted passives. There are those with a passive effect built into the description, like you were just talking about, like that give the, what is it called? Something swiftness? Falcon swiftness, is that right?
Bird of Prey, I think, now.
Yeah.
Oh, Bird of Prey. I'm thinking of the other morph, yeah. So it gives Minor Berserk just for having it slotted. There are also passive abilities that are worked into the actual trees. So, for example, sorcerers have in Stormcalling they have a passive. Let me find it. There it is. Expert Mage increases your weapon and spell damage by 2% for each sorcerer ability slotted. There are quite a few similar abilities in different trees, not just the class trees. There's also ones in like Fighters Guild and Mages Guild, for example, that will give you passive increases just for having like a certain number of abilities slotted. it's important to make sure you know what all kinds of special passive slotted buffs you can get when you're figuring out how to line up your ability bars to make sure you're getting the most use out of those passive abilities. Alright, so one little quick thing, just to make